stopping by Sheila's Audiobooks, and I am Sheila. This recording is coming from South Texas. All stories on this recording are in the public domain per United States copyright law. This story is about Odette Rider is fired by Thornton Lyne after rejecting his favors. Jack Tarling, a detective who has been working in China and just returned to London, visits his cousin Thorton Lyne at his store to discuss his cashier Milburgh's embezzlement. In his anger with Odette, Lyne decides to try to blame her for the embezzlement instead. Lyne is found dead in the park with one of Odette's nightgowns wrapped around his gunshot wound, and it doesn't look good. Tarling is determined to prove her innocent. "She lived good and she died good," said the Chinaman calmly. The speech of the Englishman offended her, and he called her many bad names because she would not come and sit on his knee, and if he put shame upon her by embracing her before the eyes of men, she was yet good, and she died very honorably. Another interval of silence. "I see," said Tarling quietly. "And when you said you would come with me to England, did you expect to meet the bad Englishman?" Ling Chu shook his head. "I had put it from my mind," he said, "until I saw him that day in the big shop. Then the evil spirit which I had thought was all burnt out inside me, blazed up again." He stopped. "And you desired his death?" said Tarling, and a nod was his answer. "You shall tell me all, Ling Chu," said Tarling. The man was now pacing the room with restless strides, his emotion betrayed only by the convulsive clutching and unclutching of his hands. "The little Daffodil was very dear to me," he said. "Soon I think she would have married and have had children, and her name would have been blessed after the fashion of our people, for did not the great master say, 'What is more worshipful than the mother of children?' And when she died, master, my heart was empty, for there was no other love in my life. And then the Ho Sing murder was committed, and I went into the interior to search for Lu Fang, and that helped me to forget. I had forgotten till I saw him again. Then the old sorrow grew large in my soul, and I went out." "To kill him," said Tarling quietly. "To kill him," repeated the man. "Tell me all," said Tarling, drawing a long breath. "It was the night you went to the little girl," said Ling Chu. Tarling knew that he spoke of Odette Rider. "I had made up my mind to go out, but I could not find an excuse because, master, you have given me orders that I must not leave this place whilst you are out. So I asked if I might go with you to the house of many houses." "To the flat?" nodded Tarling. "Yes, go on." "I had taken your quick pistol and had loaded it and put it in my overcoat pocket. You told me to trail you, but when I had seen you on your way I left you and went to the big shop." "To the big shop?" said Tarling in surprise. "But Lyne did not live in his stores." "So I discovered," said Ling Chu simply. "I thought in such a large house he would have built himself a beautiful room. In China many masters live in their shops. So I went to the big store to search it." "Did you get in?" asked Tarling in surprise, and again Ling Chu smiled. "That was very easy," he said. "The master knows how well I climb, and there were long iron pipes leading to the roof. Up one of these I climbed. Two sides of the shop are on big streets. One side is on a smaller street, and the fourth side is in a very small piece street with few lights. It was up this side that I went. On the roof were many doors, and to such a man as me there was no difficulty." "Go on," said Tarling again. "I came down from floor to floor, always in darkness, but each floor I searched carefully, but found nothing but great bundles and packing cases and long bars." "Counters," corrected Tarling. "Yes," nodded Ling Chu, "they are called counters. And then at last I came to the floor where I had seen the man." He paused. "First I went to the great room where we had met him, and that was locked. I opened it with a key, but it was in darkness, and I knew nobody was there. Then I went along a passage very carefully, because there was a light at the other end, and I came to an office." "Empty, of course?" "It was empty," said the Chinaman, "but a light was burning, and the desk cover was open. I thought he must be there, and I slipped behind the bureau, taking the pistol from my pocket. Presently I heard a footstep. I peeped out and saw the big white-faced man." "Milburgh," said Tarling. "So he is called," replied the Chinaman. He sat at the young man's desk. I knew it was the young man's desk, because there were many pictures upon it and flowers, such as he would have. The big man had his back to me. "What was he doing?" asked Tarling. "He was searching the desk, looking for something. Presently I saw him take from one of the drawers, which he opened, an envelope. From where I stood I could see into the drawer, and there were many little things such as tourists buy in China. From the envelope he took the hong." Tarling started. He knew of the hong to which the man referred. It was the little red slip of paper bearing the Chinese characters which was found upon Thornton Lyne's body that memorable morning in Hyde Park. Yes, he said eagerly. "What happened then?" "He put the envelope in his pocket and went out. I heard him walking along the passage, and then I crept out from my hiding place and I also looked at the desk. I put the revolver down by my side, because I wanted both hands for the search, but I found nothing, only one little piece book that the master uses to write down from day to day all that happens to him." "A diary?" thought Tarling. "Well, and what next?" he asked. "I got up to search the room and tripped over a wire. It must have been the wire attached to the electric light above the desk, for the room suddenly became dark, and at that moment I heard the big man's footsteps returning and slipped out of the door. And that is all, master," said Ling Chu simply. "I went back to the roof quickly for fear I should be discovered and it should bring dishonor to you." Tarling whistled. "And left the pistol behind?" he said. "That is nothing but the truth," said Ling Chu. "I have dishonored myself in your eyes, and in my heart I am a murderer, for I went to that place to kill the man who had brought shame to me and to my honorable relation." "And left the pistol behind?" said Tarling again. "And Milburgh found it." Chapter 20. Mr. Milburgh sees it through. Ling Chu's story was not difficult to believe. It was less difficult to believe that he was lying. There is no inventor in the world so clever, so circumstantial, so exact as to detail, as the Chinaman. He is a born teller of stories and piecer together of circumstances that fit so closely that it is difficult to see the joints. Yet the man had been frank, straightforward, patently honest. He had even placed himself in Tarling's power by his confession of his murderous intention. Tarling could reconstruct the scene after the Chinaman had left. Milburgh stumbling in the dark, striking a match and discovering a wall plug had been pulled away, reconnecting the lamp, and seeing to his amazement a murderous-looking pistol on the desk. It was possible that Milburgh, finding the pistol, had been deceived into believing that he had overlooked it on his previous search. But what had happened to the weapon between the moment that Ling Chu left it on Thornton Lyne's private desk and when it was discovered in the work basket of Odette Rider in the flat at Carrymore Mansions? And what had Milburgh been doing in the store by himself so late at night? And more particularly, what had he been doing in Thornton Lyne's private room? It was unlikely that Lyne would leave his desk unlocked, and the only inference to be drawn was that Milburgh had unlocked it himself with the object of searching its contents. And the hong? Those sinister little squares of red paper with the Chinese characters, one of which had been found in Thornton Lyne's pocket? The explanation of their presence in Thornton Lyne's desk was simple. He had been a globetrotter and had collected curios, and it was only natural that he should collect these slips of paper, which were on sale in most of the big Chinese towns as a souvenir of the predatory methods of the Cheerful Hearts. His conversation with Ling Chu would have to be reported to Scotland Yard, and that august institution would draw its own conclusions. In all probability they would be most unfavorable to Ling Chu, who would come immediately under suspicion. Tarling, however, was satisfied, or perhaps it would be more accurate to say inclined to be satisfied, with his retainer's statement. Some of his story was susceptible to verification, and the detective lost no time in making his way to the stores. The topographical situation was as Ling Chu had described it. Tarling went to the back of the big block of buildings, into the small, quiet street of which Ling Chu had spoken, and was able to distinguish the iron rain pipe, one of many, up which the Chinaman had clambered. Ling Chu would negotiate that task without any physical distress. He could climb like a cat, as Tarling knew, and that part of his story put no great tax upon the detective's credulity. He walked back to the front of the shop, past the huge plate glass windows, fringed now with shoppers with whom Lyne's store had acquired a new and morbid interest, and through the big swinging doors onto the crowded floor. Mr. Milburgh was in his office, said a shop walker, and led the way. Mr. Milburgh's office was much larger and less ornate than his late employer's. He greeted Tarling effusively, and pushed an armchair forward and produced a box of cigars. "We're in rather a turmoil and upset now, Mr. Tarling," he said in his ingratiating voice, with that set smile of his which never seemed to leave his face. "The auditors, or rather I should say the accountants, have taken away all the books, and of course that imposes a terrible strain on me, Mr. Tarling. It means that we've got to organize a system of interim accounts, and you as a businessman will understand just what that means." "You work pretty hard, Mr. Milburgh," said Tarling. "Why, yes, sir," smiled Milburgh. "I've always worked hard." "You were working pretty hard before Mr. Lyne was killed, were you not?" asked Tarling. "Yes," hesitated Milburgh. "I can say honestly that I was." "Very late at night?" Milburgh still smiled, but there was a steely look in his eye as he answered. "Frequently I worked late at night." "Do you remember the night of the 11th? asked Tarling. Milburgh looked at the ceiling for inspiration. "Yes, I think I do. I was working very late that night." "In your own office?" "No," replied the other readily, "I did most of my work in Mr. Lyne's office, at his request," he added. A bold statement to make to a man who knew that Lyne suspected him of robbing the firm. But Milburgh was nothing if not bold. "Did he also give you the key of his desk?" asked the detective dryly. "Yes, sir," beamed Mr. Milburgh, "of course he did. You see, Mr. Lyne trusted me absolutely." He said this so naturally and with such assurance that Tarling was staggered. Before he had time to speak, the other went on. "Yes, I can truthfully say that I was in Mr. Lyne's confidence. He told me a great deal more about himself than he has told anybody and—" "One moment," said Tarling, and he spoke slowly. "Will you please tell me what you did with the revolver which you found on Mr. Lyne's desk?" "It was a Colt automatic, and it was loaded." Blank astonishment showed in Mr. Milburgh's eyes. "A loaded pistol?" he asked, raising his eyebrows. "But, my dear good Mr. Tarling, whatever are you talking about? I never found a loaded pistol on Mr. Lyne's desk, poor fellow. Mr. Lyne objected as much to these deadly weapons as myself." Here was a facer for Tarling, but he betrayed no sign either of disappointment or surprise. Milburgh was frowning as though he were attempting to piece together some half-forgotten recollection. "Is it possible," he said in a shocked voice, "that when you examined my house the other day it was with the object of discovering such a weapon as this?" "It's quite possible," said Tarling coolly, "and even probable. Now, I'm going to be very straightforward with you, Mr. Milburgh. I suspect you know a great deal more about this murder than you have told us, and that you had ever so much more reason for wishing Mr. Lyne was dead than you are prepared to admit at this moment." "Wait," he said, as the other opened his mouth to speak. "I am telling you candidly that the object of my first visit to these stores was to investigate happenings which looked very black against you. It was hardly so much the work of a detective as an accountant," he said, "but Mr. Lyne thought that I should be able to discover who was robbing the firm." "And did you?" asked Milburgh coolly. There was the ghost of a smile still upon his face, but defiance shone in his pale eyes. "I did not, because I went no further in the matter after you had expressed your agreement with Mr. Lyne that the firm had been robbed by Odette Rider." He saw the man change color, and pushed home his advantage. "I am not going to inquire too closely into your reasons for attempting to ruin an innocent girl," he said sternly. "That is a matter for your own conscience. But I tell you, Mr. Milburgh, that if you are innocent, both of the robbery and of the murder, then I've never met a guilty person in my life." "What do you mean?" asked the man loudly. "Do you dare to accuse me?" "I accuse you of nothing more than this," said Tarling, that I am perfectly satisfied that you have been robbing the firm for years. I am equally satisfied that, even if you did not kill Mr. Lyne, you at least know who did." "You're mad," sneered Milburgh, but his face was white. "Supposing it were true that I had robbed the firm, why should I want to kill Mr. Thornton Lyne? The mere fact of his death would have brought an examination into the accounts." This was a convincing argument, the more so as it was an argument which Tarling himself had employed. "As to your absurd and melodramatic charges of robbing the firm," Milburgh went on, "the books are now in the hands of an eminent firm of chartered accountants, who can give the lie to any such statement as you have made." He had recovered something of his old urbanity, and now stood, or rather straddled, with his legs apart, his thumbs in the armholes of his waistcoat, beaming benignly upon the detective. "I await the investigation of that eminent firm, Messrs. Dashwood and Solomon, with every confidence and without the least perturbation," he said. "Their findings will vindicate my honor beyond any question. I shall see this matter through." Tarling looked at him. "I admire your nerve," he said, and left the office without another word. Chapter 21. Covering the trail. Tarling had a brief interview with his assistant Whiteside, and the inspector, to his surprise, accepted his view of Ling Chu's confession. "I always thought Milburgh was a pretty cool customer," Whiteside said thoughtfully. "But he has more gall than I gave him credit for. I would certainly prefer to believe your chink than I would believe Milburgh. And, by the way, your young lady has slipped the shadow." "What are you talking about?" asked Tarling in surprise. "I am referring to your Miss Odette Rider, and why on earth a grown-up police officer with your experience should blush, I can't imagine." "I'm not blushing," said Tarling. "What about her?" "I've had 2 men watching her," explained Whiteside, "and whenever she has taken her walks abroad she has been followed, as you know. In accordance with your instructions I was taking off those shadows tomorrow, but today she went to Bond Street, and either Jackson was careless, it was Jackson who was on the job, or else the young lady was very sharp. At any rate, he waited for half an hour for her to come out of the shop, and when she didn't appear he walked in and found there was another entrance through which she had gone. Since then she has not been back to the hotel." "I don't like that," said Tarling, a little troubled. "I wished her to be under observation as much for her own protection as anything else. I wish you would keep a man at the hotel and telephone me just as soon as she returns." Whiteside nodded. "I've anticipated your wishes in that respect," he said. "Well, what is the next move?" "I'm going to Hertford to see Miss Rider's mother, and incidentally, I may pick up Miss Rider, who is very likely to have gone home." Whiteside nodded. "What do you expect to find out from the mother?" he asked. "I expect to learn a great deal," said Tarling. "There is still a minor mystery to be discovered. For example, who is the mysterious man who comes and goes to Hertford, and just why is Mrs. Rider living in luxury whilst her daughter is working for her living at Lyne's store?" "There's something in that," agreed Whiteside. "Would you like me to come along with you?" "Thanks," smiled Tarling, "I can do that little job by myself." "Reverting to Milburgh," began Whiteside. "As we always revert to Milburgh," groaned Tarling. "Yes? Well, I don't like his assurance," said Whiteside. "It looks as if all our hopes of getting a clue from the examination of Lyne's accounts are fated to be dashed." "There's something in that," said Tarling. "I don't like it myself. The books are in the hands of one of the best chartered accountants in the country, and if there has been any monkey business, he is the fellow who is certain to find it, and not only that, but to trace whatever defalcations there are to the man responsible. Milburgh is not fool enough to imagine that he won't be found out once the accountants get busy, and his cheeriness in face of exposure is to say the least disconcerting." Their little conference was being held in a prosaic public tea-room opposite the House of Commons, a tea-room the walls of which, had they ears, could have told not a few of Scotland Yard's most precious secrets. Tarling was on the point of changing the subject when he remembered the parcel of books which had arrived at the accountant's office that morning. "Rather late," said Whiteside thoughtfully. "By Jove. I wonder." "You wonder what?" I wonder if they were the 3 books that Milburgh bought yesterday? The 3 ledgers? Whiteside nodded. But why on earth should he want to put in 3 new ledgers? They were new, weren't they? That doesn't seem to me to be a very intelligent suggestion. And yet... He jumped up, almost upsetting the table in his excitement. "Quick, Whiteside. Get a cab while I settle the bill," he said. "Where are you going?" "Hurry up and get the cab," said Tarling, and when he had rejoined his companion outside, and the taxi was bowling along the Thames embankment, "I'm going to Street Mary Axe." "So I gathered from your directions to the cabman," said Whiteside. "But why Street Mary Axe at this time of the afternoon? The very respectable Dashwood and Solomon will not be glad to see you until tomorrow." "I'm going to see these books," said Tarling, "the books which Milburgh sent to the accountants this morning." "What do you expect to find?" "I'll tell you later," was Tarling's reply. He looked at his watch. "They won't be closed yet, thank heaven." The taxi was held up at the juncture of the Embankment and Blackfriars Bridge, and was held up again for a different reason in Queen Victoria Street. Suddenly there was a clang-clang of gongs, and all traffic drew to one side to allow the passage of a flying motor fire engine. Another and another followed in succession. "A big fire," said Whiteside. "Or it may be a little one, because they get very panicky in the city, and they'll put in a divisional call for a smoking chimney." The cab moved on, and had crossed Cannon Street, when it was again held up by another roaring motor, this time bearing a fire escape. "Let's get out of the cab, we'll walk," said Tarling. They jumped out, and Whiteside paid the driver. "This way," said Tarling. "We'll make a short cut." Whiteside had stopped to speak to a policeman. "Where's the fire, constable?" he asked. "Street Mary Axe, sir," was the policeman's reply. "A big firm of chartered accountants, Dashwood and Solomon." "You know them, sir?" "I'm told the place is blazing from cellar to garret." Tarling showed his teeth in an unamused grin as the words came to him. "And all the proof of Milburgh's guilt gone up in smoke, eh?" he said. "I think I know what those books contained, a little clockwork detonator and a few pounds of thermite to burn up all the clues to the Daffodil murder." Chapter 22. The Heavy Wallet. All that remained of the once stately, if restricted, premises of Messrs. Dashwood and Solomon was a gaunt-looking front wall, blackened by the fire. Tarling interviewed the chief of the fire brigade. "It'll be days before we can get inside," said that worthy, "and I very much doubt if there's anything left intact. The whole of the building has been burnt out, you can see for yourself the roof has gone in, and there's very little chance of recovering anything of an inflammable nature unless it happens to be in a safe." Tarling caught sight of the brusque Sir Felix Solomon gazing, without any visible evidence of distress, upon the wreckage of his office. "We are covered by insurance," said Sir Felix philosophically, "and there is nothing of any great importance, except, of course, those documents and books from Lyne's store." "They weren't in the fire-proof vault?" asked Tarling, and Sir Felix shook his head. "No," he said, "they were in a strong room, and curiously enough, it was in that strong room where the fire originated. The room itself was not fireproof, and it would have been precious little use if it had been, as the fire started inside. The first news we received was when a clerk, going down to the basement, saw flames leaping out between the steel bars which constitute the door of No. 4 vault." Tarling nodded. "I need not ask you whether the books which Mr. Milburgh brought this morning had been placed in that safe, Sir Felix," he said, and the knight looked surprised. "Of course not. They were placed there whilst you were in the office," he said. "Why do you ask?" "Because in my judgment those books were not books at all in the usually understood sense. Unless I am at fault, the parcel contained 3 big ledgers glued together, the contents being hollowed out and that hollow filled with thermite, a clockwork detonator, or the necessary electric apparatus to start a spark at a given moment." The accountant stared at him. "You're joking," he said, but Tarling shook his head. "I was never more serious in my life." "But who would commit such an infernal act as that?" "Why, One of my clerks was nearly burnt to death. The man who would commit such an infernal act as that, repeated Tarling slowly, is the man who has every reason for wishing to avoid an examination of Lyne's accounts. You don't mean? I'll mention no names for the moment, and if inadvertently I have conveyed the identity of the gentleman of whom I have been speaking, I hope you will be good enough to regard it as confidential, said Tarling, and went back to his crestfallen subordinate. No wonder Milburgh was satisfied with the forthcoming examination, he said bitterly. The devil had planted that parcel, and had timed it probably to the minute. Well, there's nothing more to be done tonight, with Milburgh. He looked at his watch. I'm going back to my flat, and afterwards to Hertford, he said. He had made no definite plan as to what line he should pursue after he reached Hertford. He had a dim notion that his investigation hereabouts might, if properly directed, lead him nearer to the heart of the mystery. This pretty, faded woman who lived in such style, and whose husband was so seldom visible, might give him a key. Somewhere it was in existence, that key, by which he could decipher the jumbled code of the Daffodil murder, and it might as well be at Hertford as nearer at hand. It was dark when he came to the home of Mrs. Rider, for this time he had dispensed with a cab, and had walked the long distance between the station and the house, desiring to avoid attention. The dwelling stood on the main road. It had a high wall frontage of about 350 feet. The wall was continued down the side of a lane, and at the other end marked the boundary of a big paddock. The entrance to the grounds was through a wrought iron gate of strength, the design of which recalled something which he had seen before. On his previous visit the gate had been unfastened, and he had had no difficulty in reaching the house. Now, however, it was locked. He put his flashlight over the gate and the supporting piers, and discovered a bell, evidently brand new, and recently fixed. He made no attempt to press the little white button, but continued his reconnaissance. About half a dozen yards inside the gateway was a small cottage, from which a light showed, and apparently the bell communicated with this dwelling. Whilst he was waiting, he heard a whistle and a quick footstep coming up the road, and drew into the shadow. Somebody came to the gate, he heard the faint tinkle of a bell and a door opened. The newcomer was a newspaper boy, who pushed a bundle of evening papers through the iron bars and went off again. Tarling waited until he heard the door of the cottage or lodge close. Then he made a circuit of the house, hoping to find another entrance. There was evidently a servant's entrance at the back, leading from the lane, but this too was closed. Throwing his light up, he saw that there was no broken glass on top of the wall, as there had been in the front of the house, and, making a jump, he caught the stone coping and drew himself up and astride. He dropped into the darkness on the other side without any discomfort to himself, and made his cautious way towards the house. Dogs were the danger, but apparently Mrs. Rider did not keep dogs, and his progress was unchallenged. He saw no light either in the upper or lower windows until he got to the back. Here was a pillared porch, above which had been built what appeared to be a conservatory. Beneath the porch was a door and a barred window, but it was from the conservatory above that a faint light emanated. He looked round for a ladder without success. But the portico presented no more difficulties than the wall had done. By stepping onto the windowsill and steadying himself against one of the pillars, he could reach an iron stanchion, which had evidently been placed to support the framework of the superstructure. From here to the parapet of the conservatory itself was but a swing. This glass house had casement windows, one of which was open, and he leaned on his elbows and cautiously intruded his head. The place was empty. The light came from an inner room opening into the glass-sheltered balcony. Quickly he slipped through the windows and crouched under the shadow of a big oleander. The atmosphere of the conservatory was close and the smell was earthy. He judged from the hot water pipes which his groping hands felt that it was a tiny winter garden erected by the owner of the house for her enjoyment in the dark, cold days. French windows admitted to the inner room, and, peering through the casement curtains which covered them, Tarling saw Mrs. Rider. She was sitting at a desk, a pen in her hand, her chin on her fingertips. She was not writing, but staring blankly at the wall, as though she were at a loss for what to say. The light came from a big alabaster bowl hanging a foot below the ceiling level, and it gave the detective an opportunity of making a swift examination. The room was furnished simply if in perfect taste, and had the appearance of a study. Beside her desk was a green safe, half let into the wall and half exposed. There were a few prints hanging on the walls, a chair or two, a couch half hidden from the detective's view, and that was all. He had expected to see Odette Rider with her mother, and was disappointed. Not only was Mrs. Rider alone, but she conveyed the impression that she was practically alone in the house. Tarling knelt, watching her, for 10 minutes, until he heard a sound outside. He crept softly back and looked over the edge of the portico in time to see a figure moving swiftly along the path. It was riding a bicycle which did not carry a light. Though he strained his eyes, he could not tell whether the rider was man or woman. It disappeared under the portico and he heard the grating of the machine as it was leant against one of the pillars, the click of a key in the lock and the sound of a door opening. Then he crept back to his observation post overlooking the study. Mrs. Rider had evidently not heard the sound of the door opening below, and sat without movement still staring at the wall before her. Presently she started and looked round towards the door. Tarling noted the door, too, the electric switch just in view. Then the door opened slowly. He saw Mrs. Rider's face light up with pleasure, then somebody asked a question in a whisper, and she answered. He could just hear her words. "No, darling, nobody." Tarling held his breath and waited. Then, of a sudden, the light in the room was extinguished. Whoever had entered had turned out the light. He heard a soft footfall coming towards the window looking into the conservatory and the rattle of the blinds as they were lowered. Then the light went up again, but he could see nothing or hear nothing. Who was Mrs. Rider's mysterious visitor? There was only one way to discover, but he waited a little longer, in fact, until he heard the soft slam of a safe door closing, before he slipped again through the window and dropped to the ground. The bicycle was, as he had expected, leaning against one of the pillars. He could see nothing, and did not dare flash his lamp, but his sensitive fingers ran over its lines, and he barely checked an exclamation of surprise. It was a lady's bicycle. He waited a little while, then withdrew to a shrubbery opposite the door on the other side of the drive up which the cyclist had come. He had not long to wait before the door under the portico opened again and closed. Somebody jumped onto the bicycle as Tarling leapt from his place of concealment. He pressed the key of his electric lamp, but for some reason it did not act. He felt rather than heard a shiver of surprise from the person on the machine. "I want you," said Tarling, and put out his hands. He missed the rider by the fraction of an inch, but saw the machine swerve and heard the soft thud of something falling. A second later the machine and rider had disappeared in the pitch darkness. He refixed his lamp. Pursuit, he knew, was useless without his lantern, and, cursing the maker thereof, he adjusted another battery, and put the light on the ground to see what it was that the fugitive had dropped. He thought he heard a smothered exclamation behind him and turned swiftly, but nobody came within the radius of his lamp. He must be getting nervy, he thought, and continued his inspection of the wallet. It was a long, leather portfolio, about 10 inches in length and 5 inches in depth, and it was strangely heavy. He picked it up, felt for the clasp, and found instead 2 tiny locks. He made another examination by the light of his lantern, an examination which was interrupted by a challenge from above. "Who are you?" It was Mrs. Rider's voice, and just then it was inconvenient for him to reveal himself. Without a word in answer, he switched off his light and slipped into the bushes, and, more as the result of instinct than judgment, regained the wall, at almost the exact spot he had crossed it. The road was empty, and there was no sign of the cyclist. There was only one thing to do, and that was to get back to town as quickly as possible and examine the contents of the wallet at his leisure. It was extraordinarily heavy for its size, he was reminded of that fact by his sagging pocket. The road back to Hertford seemed interminable and the clocks were chiming 11:15 when he entered the station yard. "Train to London, sir?" said the porter. "You've missed the last train to London by 5 minutes. Chapter 23. The Night Visitor. Tarling was less in a dilemma than in that condition of uncertainty which is produced by having no definite plans one way or the other. There was no immediate necessity for his return to town, and his annoyance at finding the last train gone was due rather to a natural desire to sleep in his own bed than to any other cause. He might have got a car from a local garage and motored to London if there had been any particular urgency, but, he told himself, he might as well spend the night in Hertford as in Bond Street. If he had any leanings towards staying at Hertford, it was because he was anxious to examine the contents of the wallet at his leisure. If he had any call to town, it might be discovered in his anxiety as to what had happened to Odette Rider, whether she had returned to her hotel or was still marked missing by the police. He could, at any rate, get into communication with Scotland Yard and satisfy his mind on that point. He turned back from the station in search of lodgings. He was to find that it was not so easy to get rooms as he had imagined. The best hotel in the place was crowded out as a result of an agricultural convention which was being held in the town. He was sent on to another hotel, only to find that the same state of congestion existed, and finally after half an hour's search he found accommodation at a small commercial hotel which was surprisingly empty. His first step was to get into communication with London, and this was established without delay. Nothing had been heard of Odette Rider, and the only news of importance was that the ex-convict, Sam Stay, had escaped from the county lunatic asylum to which he had been removed. Tarling went up to the commodious sitting room. He was mildly interested in the news about Stay, for the man had been a disappointment. This criminal, whose love for Thornton Lyne had, as Tarling suspected rightly, been responsible for his mental collapse, might have supplied a great deal of information as to the events which led up to the day of the murder, and his dramatic breakdown had removed a witness who might have offered material assistance to the police. Tarling closed the door of his sitting room behind him, pulled the wallet from his pocket and laid it on the table. He tried first with his own keys to unfasten the flap, but the locks defied him. The heaviness of the wallet surprised and piqued him, but he was soon to find an explanation for its extraordinary weight. He opened his pocket knife and began to cut away the leather about the locks, and uttered an exclamation. So that was the reason for the heaviness of the pouch. It was only leather covered. Beneath this cover was a lining of fine steel mail. The wallet was really a steel chain bag, the locks being welded to the chain and absolutely immovable. He threw the wallet back on the table with a laugh. He must restrain his curiosity until he got back to the yard, where the experts would make short work of the best locks which were ever invented. Whilst he sat watching the thing upon the table and turning over in his mind the possibility of its contents, he heard footsteps pass his door and mount the stairway opposite which his sitting room was situated. Visitors in the same plight as himself, he thought. Somehow, being in a strange room amidst unfamiliar surroundings, gave the case a new aspect. It was an aspect of unreality. They were all so unreal, the characters in this strange drama. Thornton Lyne seemed fantastic, and fantastic indeed was his end. Milburgh, with his perpetual smirk, his little stoop, his broad, fat face and half-bald head, Mrs. Rider, a pale ghost of a woman who flitted in and out of the story, or rather hovered about it, never seeming to intrude, yet never wholly separated from its tragic process, Ling Chu, imperturbable, bringing with him the atmosphere of that land of intrigue and mystery and motive, China. Odette Rider alone was real. She was life, warm, palpitating, wonderful. Tarling frowned and rose stiffly from his chair. He despised himself a little for this weakness of his. Odette Rider. A woman still under suspicion of murder, a woman whom it was his duty, if she were guilty, to bring to the scaffold, and the thought of her turned him hot and cold. He passed through to his bedroom which adjoined the sitting room, put the wallet on a table by the side of his bed, locked the bedroom door, opened the windows and prepared himself, as best he could, for the night. There was a train leaving Hertford at 5 in the morning and he had arranged to be called in time to catch it. He took off his boots, coat, vest, collar and tie, unbuckled his belt. He was one of those eccentrics to whom the braces of civilization were anathema, and lay down on the outside of the bed, pulling the eiderdown over him. Sleep did not come to him readily. He turned from side to side, thinking. Suppose there had been some mistake in the time of the accident at Ashford? Suppose the doctors were wrong and Thornton Lyne was murdered at an earlier hour? Suppose Odette Rider was in reality a cold-blooded. He growled away the thought. He heard the church clock strike the hour of 2 and waited impatiently for the quarter to chime. He had heard every quarter since he had retired to bed. But he did not hear that quarter. He must have fallen into an uneasy sleep, for he began to dream. He dreamt he was in China again and had fallen into the hands of that baneful society, the Cheerful Hearts. He was in a temple, lying on a great black slab of stone, bound hand and foot, and above him he saw the leader of the gang, knife in hand, peering down into his face with a malicious grin, and it was the face of Odette Rider. He saw the knife raised and woke sweating. The church clock was booming 3 and a deep silence lay on the world. But there was somebody in his room. He knew that and lay motionless, peering out of half-closed eyes from one corner to the other. There was nobody to be seen, nothing to be heard, but his sixth sense told him that somebody was present. He reached out his hand carefully and silently to the table and searched for the wallet. It was gone. Then he heard the creak of a board, and it came from the direction of the door leading to the sitting room. With one bound he was out of bed in time to see the door flung open and a figure slip through. He was after it in a second. The burglar might have escaped, but unexpectedly there was a crash and a cry. He had fallen over a chair, and before he could rise Tarling was on him and had flung him back. He leapt to the door. It was open. He banged it close and turned the key. "Now, let's have a look at you," said Tarling grimly, and switched on the light. He fell back against the door, his mouth open in amazement, for the intruder was Odette Rider, and in her hand she held the stolen wallet. Chapter 24. The Confession of Odette Rider. He could only gaze in stupefied silence. "You?" he said wonderingly. The girl was pale and her eyes never left his face. She nodded. "Yes, it is I," she said in a low voice. "You?" he said again and walked towards her. He held out his hand and she gave him the wallet without a word. "Sit down," he said kindly. He thought she was going to faint. "I hope I didn't hurt you?" "I hadn't the slightest idea." She shook her head. "Oh, I'm not hurt," she said wearily, "not hurt in the way you mean." She drew a chair to the table and dropped her face upon her hands, and he stood by, embarrassed, almost terrified, by this unexpected development. "So you were the visitor on the bicycle," he said at last. "I didn't suspect." It struck him at that moment that it was not an offense for Odette Rider to go up to her mother's house on a bicycle, or even to take away a wallet which was probably hers. If there was any crime at all, he had committed it in retaining something to which he had no right. She looked up at his words. "I? On the bicycle?" she asked. "No, it was not I." "Not you?" She shook her head. "I was in the grounds. I saw you using your lamp and I was quite close to you when you picked up the wallet," she said listlessly, "but I was not on the bicycle." "Who was it?" he asked. She shook her head. "May I have that, please?" She held out her hand and he hesitated. After all, he had no right or title to this curious purse. He compromised by putting it on the table and she did not attempt to take it. "Odette," he said gently and walked round to her, laying his hand on her shoulder. "Why don't you tell me?" "Tell you what?" she asked, without looking up. "Tell me all there is to be told," he said. "I could help you. I want to help you." She looked up at him. "Why do you want to help me?" she asked simply. He was tongue-tied for a second. "Because I love you," he said, and his voice shook. It did not seem to him that he was talking. The words came of their own volition. He had no more intention of telling her he loved her, indeed he had no more idea that he did love her, than Whiteside would have had. Yet he knew he spoke the truth and that a power greater than he had framed the words and put them on his lips. The effect on the girl seemed extraordinary to him. She did not shrink back, she did not look surprised. She showed no astonishment whatever. She just brought her eyes back to the table and said, "Oh." That calm, almost uncannily calm acceptance of a fact which Tarling had not dared to breathe to himself, was the second shock of the evening. It was as though she had known it all along. He was on his knees by her side and his arm was about her shoulders, even before his brain had willed the act. My girl," he said gently. "Won't you please tell me?" Her head was still bent and her voice was so low as to be almost inaudible. "Tell you what?" she asked. "What you know of this business," he said. "Don't you realize how every new development brings you more and more under suspicion?" "What business do you mean?" He hesitated. "The murder of Thornton Lyne. I know nothing of that." She made no response to that tender arm of his, but sat rigid. Something in her attitude chilled him and he dropped her hand and rose. When she looked up she saw that his face was white and set. He walked to the door and unlocked it. "I'm not going to ask you any more," he said quietly. "You know best why you came to me tonight. I suppose you followed me and took a room. I heard somebody going upstairs soon after I arrived." She nodded. "Do you want this?" she asked and pointed to the wallet on the table. "Take it away with you." She got up to her feet unsteadily and swayed toward him. In a second he was by her side, his arms about her. She made no resistance, but rather he felt a yielding towards him which he had missed before. Her pale face was upturned to his and he stooped and kissed her. Odette, he whispered. "Don't you realize that I love you and would give my life to save you from unhappiness? Won't you tell me everything, please?" No, she murmured with a little catch in her voice. "Please don't ask me. I am afraid. Oh, I am afraid." He crushed her in his arms, his cheek against hers, his lips tingling with the caress of her hair. "But there is nothing to be afraid of, nothing," he said eagerly. "If you were as guilty as hell, I would save you. If you are shielding somebody, I would shield them because I love you, Odette." No, she cried and pushed him back, both her little hands pressing against his chest. Don't ask me. Ask me." Tarling swung round. There was a man standing in the doorway, in the act of closing the door behind him. "Milburgh," he said between his teeth. "Milburgh," smiled the other mockingly. "I am sorry to interrupt this beautiful scene, but the occasion is a desperate one and I cannot afford to stand on ceremony, Mr. Tarling." Tarling put the girl from him and looked at the smirking manager. One comprehensive glance the detective gave him, noted the cycling clips and the splashes of mud on his trousers, and understood. "So you were the cyclist, eh?" he said. "That's right," said Milburgh. "It is an exercise to which I am very partial." "What do you want?" asked Tarling, alert and watchful. "I want you to carry out your promise, Mr. Tarling," said Milburgh smoothly. Tarling stared at him. "My promise," he said. "What promise?" "To protect, not only the evildoer, but those who have compromised themselves in an effort to shield the evildoer from his or her own wicked act." Tarling started. "Do you mean to say," he said hoarsely, "do you mean to accuse?" "I accuse nobody," said Milburgh with a wide sweep of his hands. "I merely suggest that both Miss Rider and myself are in very serious trouble and that you have it in your power to get us safely out of this country to one where extradition laws cannot follow." Tarling took one step towards him and Milburgh shrank back. "Do you accuse Miss Rider of complicity in this murder?" he demanded. Milburgh smiled, but it was an uneasy smile. "I make no accusation," he said, "and as to the murder?" He shrugged his shoulders. "You will understand better when you read the contents of that wallet which I was endeavoring to remove to a place of safety." Tarling picked up the wallet from the table and looked at it. "I shall see the contents of this wallet tomorrow," he said. "Locks will present very little difficulty." "You can read the contents tonight," said Milburgh smoothly, and pulled from his pocket a chain, at the end of which dangled a small bunch of keys. "Here is the key," he said. "Unlock and read tonight." Tarling took the key in his hand, inserted it in first one tiny lock and then in the other. The catches snapped open and he threw back the flap. Then a hand snatched the portfolio from him and he turned to see the girl's quivering face and read the terror in her eyes. "No, no," she cried, almost beside herself. "No, for God's sake, no." Tarling stepped back. He saw the malicious little smile on Milburgh's face and could have struck him down. "Miss Rider does not wish me to see what is in this case," he said. "And for an excellent reason," sneered Milburgh. "Here." It was the girl's voice, surprisingly clear and steady. Her shaking hands held the paper she had taken from the wallet and she thrust it toward the detective. "There is a reason," she said in a low voice. "But it is not the reason you suggest." Milburgh had gone too far. Tarling saw his face lengthen and the look of apprehension in his cold blue eyes. Then, without further hesitation, he opened the paper and read. The first line took away his breath. "The confession of Odette Rider." "Good God," he muttered and read on. There were only half a dozen lines and they were in the firm calligraphy of the girl. "I, Odette Rider, hereby confess that for 3 years I have been robbing the firm of Lyne's Stores, Limited, and during that period have taken the sum of £25,000. Tarling dropped the paper and caught the girl as she fainted. Chapter 25. Milburgh's last bluff. Milburgh had gone too far. He had hoped to carry through this scene without the actual disclosure of the confession. In his shrewd, clever way he had realized before Tarling himself that the detective from Shanghai, this heir to the Lyne millions, had fallen under the spell of the girl's beauty, and all his conjectures had been confirmed by the scene he had witnessed, no less than by the conversation he had overheard before the door was opened. He was seeking immunity and safety. The man was in a panic, though this Tarling did not realize, and was making his last desperate throw for the life that he loved, that life of ease and comfort to secure which he had risked so much. Milburgh had lived in terror that Odette Rider would betray him, and because of his panicky fear that she had told all to the detective that night he brought her back to London from Ashford, he had dared attempt to silence the man whom he believed was the recipient of the girl's confidence. Those shots in the foggy night which had nearly ended the career of Jack Tarling had their explanation in Milburgh's terror of exposure. One person in the world, one living person, could place him in the felon's dock, and if she betrayed him. Tarling had carried the girl to a couch and had laid her down. He went quickly into his bedroom, switching on the light, to get a glass of water. It was Milburgh's opportunity. A little fire was burning in the sitting room. Swiftly he picked the confession from the floor and thrust it into his pocket. On a little table stood a writing cabinet. From this he took a sheet of the hotel paper, crumpled it up and thrust it into the fire. It was blazing when Tarling returned. "What are you doing?" he asked, halting by the side of the couch. "I am burning the young lady's confession," said Milburgh calmly. "I do not think it is desirable in the interests." "Wait," said Tarling calmly. He lowered the girl's head and sprinkled some of the water on her face, and she opened her eyes with a little shudder. Tarling left her for a second and walked to the fire. The paper was burnt save a scrap of the edge that had not caught, and this he lifted gingerly, looked at it for a moment, then cast his eyes round the room. He saw that the stationery cabinet had been disturbed and laughed. It was neither a pleasant nor an amused laugh. "That's the idea, eh?" he said, walked to the door, closed it and stood with his back to it. "Now, Milburgh, you can give me that confession you've got in your pocket." "I've burnt it, Mr. Tarling." "You're a liar," said Tarling calmly. "You knew very well I wouldn't let you go out of this room with that confession in your pocket and you tried to bluff me by burning a sheet of writing paper. I want that confession." "I assure you," began Milburgh. "I want that confession," said Tarling, and with a sickly smile. Milburgh put his hand in his pocket and drew out the crumpled sheet. "Now, if you are anxious to see it burn," said Tarling, "you will have an opportunity." He read the statement again and put it into the fire, watched it until it was reduced to ashes, then beat the ashes down with a poker. That's that, said Tarling cheerfully. I suppose you know what you've done, said Milburgh. You've destroyed evidence which you, as an officer of the law. Cut that out, replied Tarling shortly. For the second time that night he unlocked the door and flung it wide open. Milburgh, you can go, I know where I can find you when I want you, he said. You'll be sorry for this, said Milburgh. Not half as sorry as you'll be by the time I'm through with you, retorted Tarling. I shall go straight to Scotland Yard, fumed the man, white with passion. Do, by all means, said the detective coolly, and be good enough to ask them to detain you until I come. With this shot he closed the door upon the retreating man. The girl was sitting now on the edge of the sofa, her brave eyes surveying the man who loved her. What have you done? She asked. I've destroyed that precious confession of yours, said Tarling cheerfully. It occurred to me in the space of time it took to get from you to my washstand, that confession may have been made under pressure. I am right, aren't I? She nodded. Now, you wait there a little while I make myself presentable and I'll take you home. Take me home? Said the startled girl. Not to mother, no, no. She mustn't ever know. On the contrary, she must know. I don't know what it is she mustn't know, said Tarling with a little smile, but there has been a great deal too much mystery already, and it is not going to continue. She rose and walked to the fireplace, her elbows on the mantelpiece, and her head back. I'll tell you all I can. Perhaps you're right, she said. There has been too much mystery. You asked me once who was Milburgh. She turned and half-faced him. I won't ask you that question any more, he said quietly. I know. You know? Yes, Milburgh is your mother's second husband. Her eyes opened. How did you find out that? I guessed that, he smiled, and she keeps her name Rider at Milburgh's request. He asked her not to reveal the fact that she was married again. Isn't that so? She nodded. Mother met him about 7 years ago. We were at Harrogate at the time. You see, Mother had a little money, and I think Mr. Milburgh thought it was much more than it actually was. He was a very agreeable man and told Mother that he had a big business in the city. Mother believes that he is very well off. Tarling whistled. I see, he said. Milburgh has been robbing his employers and spending the money on your mother. She shook her head. That is partly true and partly untrue, she said. Mother has been an innocent participant. He bought this house at Hertford and furnished it lavishly. He kept 2 cars until a year ago, when I made him give them up and live more simply. You don't know what these years have meant, Mr. Tarling, since I discovered how deeply Mother would be dragged down by the exposure of his villainy. How did you find it out? It was soon after the marriage, said the girl. I went into Lyne's store one day and one of the employees was rude to me. I shouldn't have taken much notice, but an officious shop walker dismissed the girl on the spot, and when I pleaded for her reinstatement, he insisted that I should see the manager. I was ushered into a private office, and there I saw Mr. Milburgh and realized the kind of double life he was living. He made me keep his secret, painted a dreadful picture of what would happen, and said he could put everything right if I would come into the business and help him. He told me he had large investments which were bringing in big sums and that he would apply this money to making good his defalcations. That was why I went into Lyne's store, but he broke his word from the very beginning. Why did he put you there? Asked Tarling. Because, if there had been another person, said the girl, he might have been detected. He knew that any inquiries into irregularities of accounts would come first to my department, and he wanted to have somebody there who would let him know. He did not betray this thought, said the girl, but I guessed that that was the idea at the back of his mind. She went on to tell him something of the life she had lived, the humiliation she suffered in her knowledge of the despicable part she was playing. From the first I was an accessory, she said. It is true that I did not steal, but my reason for accepting the post was in order to enable him, as I thought, to right a grievous wrong and to save my mother from the shame and misery which would follow the exposure of Milburgh's real character. She looked at him with a sad little smile. I hardly realize that I am speaking to a detective, she said, and all that I have suffered during these past years has been in vain, but the truth must come now, whatever be the consequences. She paused. And now I am going to tell you what happened on the night of the murder. Chapter 26. In Mrs. Rider's room. There was a deep silence. Tarling could feel his heart thumping almost noisily. After I had left Lynn's store, she said, I had decided to go to Mother to spend 2 or 3 days with her before I began looking for work. Mr. Milburgh only went to Hartford for the weekends, and I couldn't stay in the same house with him, knowing all that I knew. I left my flat at about 6:30 that evening, but I am not quite sure of the exact time. It must have been somewhere near then, because I was going to catch the 7 o'clock train to Hartford. I arrived at the station and had taken my ticket, and was stooping to pick up my bag, when I felt a hand on my arm, and turning, saw Mr. Milburgh. He was in a state of great agitation and distress, and asked me to take a later train and accompany him to the Florentine restaurant, where he had taken a private room. He told me he had very bad news and that I must know. I put my bag in the cloakroom and went off with him, and over the dinner, I only had a cup of tea. As a matter of fact, he told me that he was on the verge of ruin. He said that Mr. Lyne had sent for a detective, which was you, and had the intention of exposing him, only Mr. Lyne's rage against me was so great, that for the moment he was diverted from his purpose. Only you can save me, said Milburgh. I said in astonishment, how can I save you? Take the responsibility for the theft upon yourself, he said. Your mother is involved in this heavily. Does she know? He nodded. I found afterwards that he was lying to me and was preying upon my love for Mother. I was dazed and horrified, said the girl, at the thought that poor dear Mother might be involved in this horrible scandal, and when he suggested that I should write a confession at his dictation and should leave by the first train for the continent until the matter blew over, I fell in with his scheme without protest, and that is all. Why did you come to Hartford tonight? Asked Tarling. Again she smiled. To get the confession, she said simply. I knew Milburgh would keep it in the safe. I saw him when I left the hotel. He had telephoned to me and made the appointment at the shop where I slipped the detectives, and it was there that he told me. She stopped suddenly and went red. He told you I was fond of you, said Tarling quietly, and she nodded. He threatened to take advantage of that fact, and wanted to show you the confession. I see, said Tarling, and heaved a deep sigh of relief. Thank God, he said fervently. For what? She asked, looking at him in astonishment. That everything is clear. Tomorrow I will arrest the murderer of Thornton Lyne. No, not that, she said, and laid her hand on his shoulder, her distressed face looking into his. Surely not that. Mr. Milburgh could not have done it. He could not be so great a scoundrel. Who sent the wire to your mother saying you were not coming down? Milburgh, replied the girl. Did he send 2 wires, do you remember? Said Tarling. She hesitated. Yes, he did, she said. I don't know who the other was to. It was the same writing anyway, he said. But, dear, he said, you must not worry any more about it. There is a trying time ahead of you, but you must be brave, both for your own sake and for your mother's, and for mine, he added. Despite her unhappiness, she smiled faintly. You take something for granted, don't you? She asked. Am I doing that? He said in surprise. You mean, she went redder than ever, that I care enough for you, that I would make an effort for your sake? I suppose I do, said Tarling slowly. It's vanity, I suppose, perhaps it is instinct, she said, and squeezed his arm. I must take you back to your mother's place, he said. The walk from the house to the station had been a long and tedious one. The way back was surprisingly short, even though they walked at snail's pace. There never was a courting such as Tarling's, and it seemed unreal as a dream. The girl had a key of the outer gate and they passed through together. Does your mother know that you are in Hartford? Asked Tarling suddenly. Yes, replied the girl. I saw her before I came after you. Does she know? He did not care to finish the sentence. "No," said the girl, "she does not know. Poor woman, it will break her heart. She is very fond of Milburgh. Sometimes he is most kind to mother. She loves him so much that she accepted his mysterious comings and goings and all the explanations which he offered, without suspicion." They had reached the place where he had picked up the wallet, and above him gloomed the dark bulk of the portico with its glass house atop. The house was in darkness, no lights shone anywhere. "I will take you in through the door under the portico. It is the way Mr. Milburgh always comes. Have you a light?" He had his electric lamp in his pocket and he put a beam upon the keyhole. She inserted the key and uttered a note of exclamation, for the door yielded under her pressure and opened. "It is unlocked," she said. "I am sure I fastened it." Tarling put his lamp upon the lock and made a little grimace. The catch had been wedged back into the lock so that it could not spring out again. "How long were you in the house?" he asked quickly. "Only a few minutes," said the girl. "I went in just to tell mother, and I came out immediately." "Did you close the door behind you when you went in?" The girl thought a moment. "Perhaps I didn't," she said. "No, of course not. I didn't come back this way. Mother let me out by the front door." Tarling put his light into the hall and saw the carpeted stairs half a dozen feet away. He guessed what had happened. Somebody had seen the door ajar, and guessing from the fact that she had left it open that she was returning immediately, had slipped a piece of wood, which looked to be and was in fact the stalk of a match, between the catch of the spring lock and its sheath. "What has happened?" asked the girl in a troubled voice. "Nothing," said Tarling airily. "It was probably your disreputable stepfather did this. He may have lost his key." "He could have gone in the front door," said the girl uneasily. "Well, I'll go first," said Tarling with a cheerfulness which he was far from feeling. He went upstairs, his lamp in one hand, an automatic pistol in the other. The stairs ended in a balustraded landing from which two doors opened. "That is mother's room," said the girl, pointing to the nearest. A sense of impending trouble made her shiver. Tarling put his arms about her encouragingly. He walked to the door of the room, turned the handle and opened it. There was something behind the door which held it close, and exerting all his strength he pushed the door open sufficiently far to allow of his squeezing through. On the desk a table lamp was burning, the light of which was hidden from the outside by the heavily curtained windows, but it was neither at the window nor at the desk that he was looking. Mrs. Rider lay behind the door, a little smile on her face, the haft of a dagger standing out with hideous distinctness beneath her heart. Chapter 27. The Laugh in the Night. Tarling gave one glance before he turned to the girl, who was endeavoring to push past him, and catching her by the arm gently thrust her back into the passage. "What is wrong? What is wrong?" she asked in a terrified whisper. "Oh, let me go to mother." She struggled to escape from his grip, but he held her firmly. "You must be brave, for your own sake, for everybody's sake," he entreated her. Still holding her arm, he forced her to the door of the second inner room. His hand felt for the electric switch and found it. He was in what appeared to be a spare bedroom, plainly furnished, and from this a door led, apparently into the main building. "Where does that door lead?" he asked, but she did not appear to hear him. "Mother, mother," she was moaning, "what has happened to my mother?" "Where does that door lead?" he asked again, and for answer she slipped her trembling hand into her pocket and produced a key. He opened the door and found himself in a rectangular gallery overlooking the hall. She slipped past him, but he caught her and pushed her back. "I tell you, you must be calm, Odette," he said firmly. "You must not give way. Everything depends upon your courage. Where are the servants?" Then, unexpectedly, she broke away from him and raced back through the door into the wing they had left. He followed in swift pursuit. "For God's sake, Odette, don't," he cried, as she flung herself against the door and burst into her mother's room. One glance she gave, then she fell on the floor by the side of her dead mother, and flinging her arms about the form kissed the cold lips. Tarling pulled her gently away, and half-carried, half-supported her back to the gallery. A disheveled man in shirt and trousers whom Tarling thought might be the butler was hurrying along the corridor. "Arouse any women who are in the house," said Tarling in a low voice. "Mrs. Rider has been murdered." "Murdered, sir?" said the startled man. "You don't mean that?" "Quick," said Tarling sharply, "Miss Rider has fainted again." They carried her into the drawing room and laid her on the couch, and Tarling did not leave her until he had seen her in the hands of 2 women servants. He went back with the butler to the room where the body lay. He turned on all the lights and made a careful scrutiny of the room. The window leading onto the glass-covered balcony where he had been concealed a few hours before, was latched, locked and bolted. The curtains, which had been drawn, presumably by Milburgh when he came for the wallet, were undisturbed. From the position in which the dead woman lay and the calm on her face, he thought death must have come instantly and unexpectedly. Probably the murderer stole behind her whilst she was standing at the foot of the sofa which he had partly seen through the window. It was likely that, to beguile the time of waiting for her daughter's return, she had taken a book from a little cabinet immediately behind the door, and support for this theory came in the shape of a book which had evidently fallen out of her hand between the position in which she was found and the bookcase. Together the 2 men lifted the body onto the sofa. "You had better go down into the town and inform the police," said Tarling. "Is there a telephone here?" "Yes, sir," replied the butler. "Good, that will save you a journey," said the detective. He notified the local police officials and then got on to Scotland Yard and sent a messenger to arouse Whiteside. The faint pallor of dawn was in the sky when he looked out of the window, but the pale light merely served to emphasize the pitch darkness of the world. He examined the knife, which had the appearance of being a very ordinary butcher's knife. There were some faint initials burnt upon the hilt, but these had been so worn by constant handling that there was only the faintest trace of what they had originally been. He could see an M and 2 other letters that looked like C and A. M, C, A? He puzzled his brain to interpret the initials. Presently the butler came back. "The young lady is in a terrible state, sir, and I have sent for Dr. Thomas." Tarling nodded. "You have done very wisely," he said. "Poor girl, she has had a terrible shock." Again he went to the telephone, and this time he got into connection with a nursing home in London and arranged for an ambulance to pick up the girl without further delay. When he had telephoned to Scotland Yard, he had asked as an afterthought that a messenger should be sent to Ling Chu, instructing him to come without delay. He had the greatest faith in the Chinaman, particularly in a case like this where the trail was fresh, for Ling Chu was possessed of superhuman gifts which only the bloodhound could rival. "Nobody must go upstairs," he instructed the butler. "When the doctor and the coroner's officer come, they must be admitted by the principal entrance, and if I am not here, you must understand that under no circumstances are those stairs leading to the portico to be used." He himself went out of the main entrance to make a tour of the grounds. He had little hope that that search would lead to anything. Clues there might be in plenty when the daylight revealed them, but the likelihood of the murderer remaining in the vicinity of the scene of his crime was a remote one. The grounds were extensive and well wooded. Numerous winding paths met, and forked aimlessly, radiating out from the broad gravel paths about the house to the high walls which encircled the little estate. In one corner of the grounds was a fairly large patch, innocent of bush and offering no cover at all. He made a casual survey of this, sweeping his light across the ordered rows of growing vegetables, and was going away when he saw a black bulk which had the appearance, even in the darkness, of a gardener's house. He swept this possible cover with his lamp. Was his imagination playing him a trick, or had he caught the briefest glimpse of a white face peering round the corner? He put on his light again. There was nothing visible. He walked to the building and round it. There was nobody in sight. He thought he saw a dark form under the shadow of the building moving towards the belt of pines which surrounded the house on the 3 sides. He put on his lamp again, but the light was not powerful enough to carry the distance required, and he went forward at a jog trot in the direction he had seen the figure disappear. He reached the pines and went softly. Every now and again he stopped, and once he could have sworn he heard the cracking of a twig ahead of him. He started off at a run in pursuit, and now there was no mistaking the fact that somebody was still in the wood. He heard the quick steps of his quarry, and then there was silence. He ran on, but must have overshot the mark, for presently he heard a stealthy noise behind him. In a flash he turned back. "Who are you?" he said. "Stand out or I'll fire." There was no answer, and he waited. He heard the scraping of a boot against the brickwork, and he knew that the intruder was climbing the wall. He turned in the direction of the sound, but again found nothing. Then from somewhere above him came such a trill of demoniacal laughter as chilled his blood. The top of the wall was concealed by the overhanging branch of a tree, and his light was valueless. "Come down," he shouted, "I've got you covered." Again came that terrible laugh, half fear, half derision, and a voice shrill and harsh came down to him. "Murderer! Murderer! You killed Thornton Lyne, damn you! I've kept this for you, take it!" Something came crashing through the trees, something small and round, a splashing drop, as of water, fell on the back of Tarling's hand, and he shook it off with a cry, for it burnt like fire. He heard the mysterious stranger drop from the coping of the wall and the sound of his swift feet. He stooped and picked up the article which had been thrown at him. It was a small bottle bearing a stained chemist's label and the word vitriol. Chapter 28. The Thumbprint. It was 10 o'clock in the morning, and Whiteside and Tarling were sitting on a sofa in their shirt sleeves, sipping their coffee. Tarling was haggard and weary, in contrast to the dapper inspector of police. Though the latter had been aroused from his bed in the early hours of the morning, he at least had enjoyed a good night's sleep. They sat in the room in which Mrs. Rider had been murdered, and the rusty brown stains on the floor where Tarling had found her were eloquent of the tragedy. They sat sipping their coffee, neither man talking, and they maintained this silence for several minutes, each man following his own train of thought. Tarling, for reasons of his own, had not revealed his own adventure, and he had told the other nothing of the mysterious individual, who he was, he pretty well guessed, whom he had chased through the grounds. Presently Whiteside lit a cigarette and threw the match in the grate, and Tarling roused himself from his reverie with a jerk. "What do you make of it?" he asked. Whiteside shook his head. "If there had been property taken, it would have had a simple explanation. But nothing has gone. Poor girl." Tarling nodded. "Terrible," he said. "The doctor had to drug her before he could get her to go." "Where is she?" asked Whiteside. "I sent her on an ambulance to a nursing home in London," said Tarling shortly. "This is awful, Whiteside." "It's pretty bad," said the detective inspector, scratching his chin. "The young lady could supply no information?" "Nothing, absolutely nothing. She had gone up to see her mother and had left the door ajar, intending to return by the same way after she had interviewed Mrs. Rider. As a matter of fact, she was let out by the front door. Somebody was watching and apparently thought that she was coming out by the way she went in, waited for a time, and then, as she did not reappear, followed her into the building." "And that somebody was Milburgh?" said Whiteside. Tarling made no reply. He had his own views and for the moment was not prepared to argue. "It was obviously Milburgh," said Whiteside. "He comes to you in the night. We know that he is in Hertford. We know, too, that he tried to assassinate you because he thought the girl had betrayed him and you had unearthed his secret. He must have killed his wife, who probably knows much more about the murder than the daughter." Tarling looked at his watch. "Ling Chu should be here by now," he said. "Oh, you sent for Ling Chu, did you?" said Whiteside in surprise. "I thought that you'd given up that idea." "I phoned again a couple of hours ago," said Tarling. said Whiteside. "Do you think that he knows anything about this?" Tarling shook his head. "I believe the story he told me. Of course, when I made the report to Scotland Yard I did not expect that you people would be as credulous as I am, but I know the man. He has never lied to me." "Murder is a pretty serious business," said Whiteside. "If a man didn't lie to save his neck, he wouldn't lie at all." There was the sound of a motor below, and Tarling walked to the window. "Here is Ling Chu," he said, and a few minutes later the Chinaman came noiselessly into the room. Tarling greeted him with a curt nod, and without any preliminary told the story of the crime. He spoke in English. He had not employed Chinese since he discovered that Ling Chu understood English quite as well as he understood Cantonese, and Whiteside was able from time to time to interject a word, or correct some little slip on Tarling's part. The Chinaman listened without comment, and when Tarling had finished he made one of his queer jerky bows and went out of the room. "Here are the letters," said Whiteside, after the man had gone. Two neat piles of letters were arranged on Mrs. Rider's desk, and Tarling drew up a chair. "This is the lot?" he said. "Yes," said Whiteside. "I've been searching the house since 8 o'clock and I can find no others. Those on the right are all from Milburgh. You'll find they're simply signed with an initial, a characteristic of his, but they bear his town address." "You've looked through them?" asked Tarling. "Read 'em all," replied the other. "There's nothing at all incriminating in any of them. They're what I would call bread and butter letters, dealing with little investments which Milburgh has made in his wife's name, or rather, in the name of Mrs. Rider. It's easy to see from these how deeply the poor woman was involved without her knowing that she was mixing herself up in a great conspiracy." Tarling assented. One by one he took the letters from their envelopes, read them and replaced them. He was halfway through the pile when he stopped and carried a letter to the window. "Listen to this," he said. "Forgive the smudge, but I am in an awful hurry, and I have got my fingers inky through the overturning of an ink bottle." "Nothing startling in that," said Whiteside with a smile. "Nothing at all," admitted Tarling. "But it happens that our friend has left a very good and useful thumbprint. At least, it looks too big for a fingerprint." "Let me see it," said Whiteside, springing up. He went to the other's side and looked over his shoulder at the letter in his hand, and whistled. He turned a glowing face upon Tarling and gripped his chief by the shoulder. "We've got him," he said exultantly. "We've got him as surely as if we had him in the pen." "What do you mean?" asked Tarling. "I'll swear to that thumbprint," replied Whiteside. "It's identical with the blood mark which was left on Miss Rider's bureau on the night of the murder." "Are you sure?" "Absolutely," said Whiteside, speaking quickly. "Do you see that well? Look at those lineations. They're the same. I have the original photograph in my pocket somewhere." He searched his pocketbook and brought out a photograph of a thumbprint considerably enlarged. "Compare them," cried Whiteside in triumph. "Line for line, ridge for ridge, and furrow for furrow, it is Milburgh's thumbprint and Milburgh is my man." He took up his coat and slipped it on. "Where are you going?" "Back to London," said Whiteside grimly, "to secure a warrant for the arrest of George Milburgh, the man who killed Thornton Lyne, the man who murdered his wife, the blackest villain at large in the world today." Chapter 29. The theory of Ling Chu. Upon this scene came Ling Chu, imperturbable, expressionless, bringing with him his own atmosphere of mystery. "Well," said Tarling, "what have you discovered?" And even Whiteside checked his enthusiasm to listen. "Two people came up the stairs last night," said Ling Chu, "also the master." He looked at Tarling, and the latter nodded. "Your feet are clear," he said, "also the feet of the small-piece woman, also the naked feet." "The naked feet?" said Tarling, and Ling Chu assented. "What was the naked foot, man or woman?" asked Whiteside. "It may have been man or woman," replied the Chinaman, "but the feet were cut and were bleeding. There is mark of blood on the gravel outside." "Nonsense," said Whiteside sharply. "Let him go on," warned Tarling. "A woman came in and went out," continued Ling Chu. "That was Miss Rider," said Tarling. "Then a woman and a man came, then the barefooted one came, because the blood is over the first women's footmarks." "How do you know which was the first woman and which was the second?" asked Whiteside, interested in spite of himself. "The first woman's foot was wet," said Ling Chu. "But there had been no rain," said the detective in triumph. She was standing on the grass, said Ling Chu, and Tarling nodded his head, remembering that the girl had stood on the grass in the shadow of the bushes, watching his adventure with Milburgh. But there is one thing I do not understand, master, said Ling Chu. There is the mark of another woman's foot which I cannot find on the stair in the hall. This woman walked all round the house. I think she walked round twice, and then she walked into the garden and through the trees. Tarling stared at him. Miss Rider came straight from the house onto the road, he said, and into Hertford after me. There is the mark of a woman who has walked round the house, insisted Ling Chu, and, therefore, I think it was a woman whose feet were bare. Are there any marks of a man beside us three? I was coming to that, said Ling Chu. There is a very faint trace of a man who came early, because the wet footsteps are over his, also he left, but there is no sign of him on the gravel, only the mark of a wheel track. That was Milburgh, said Tarling. If a foot has not touched the ground, explained Ling Chu, it would leave little trace. That is why the woman's foot about the house is so hard for me, for I cannot find it on the stair. Yet I know it came from the house because I can see it leading from the door. Come, master, I will show you. He led the way down the stairs into the garden, and then for the first time Whiteside noticed that the Chinaman was barefooted. You haven't mixed your own footmarks up with somebody else's? He asked jocularly. Ling Chu shook his head. I left my shoes outside the door because it is easier for me to work so, he said calmly, slipping his feet into his small shoes. He led the way to the side of the house, and there pointed out the footprints. They were unmistakably feminine. Where the heel was a deep crescent-shaped hole, which recurred at intervals all round the house. Curiously enough, they were to be found in front of almost every window, as though the mysterious visitor had walked over the garden border as if seeking to find an entrance. They look more like slippers than shoes to me. They're undoubtedly a woman's, said Whiteside, examining one of the impressions. What do you think, Tarling? Tarling nodded and led the way back to the room. What is your theory, Ling Chu? He asked. Somebody came into the house, said the Chinaman, squeezed through the door below and up the stairs. First that somebody killed and then went to search the house, but could not get through the door. That's right, said Whiteside. You mean the door that shuts off this little wing from the rest of the house? That was locked, was it not, Tarling, when you made the discovery? Yes, said Tarling, it was locked. When they found they could not get into the house, Ling Chu went on, they tried to get through one of the windows. They? Said Tarling impatiently. Who are they? Do you mean the woman? The new theory was disturbing. He had pierced the second actor in the tragedy. A brown vitriol burn on the back of his hand reminded him of his existence, but who was the third? I mean the woman, replied Ling Chu quietly. But who in God's name wanted to get into the house after murdering Mrs. Rider? Asked Whiteside irritably. Your theory is against all reason, Ling Chu. When a person has committed a murder, they want to put as much distance between themselves and the scene of the crime as they can in the shortest possible space of time. Ling Chu did not reply. How many people are concerned in this murder? Said Tarling. A barefooted man or woman came in and killed Mrs. Rider. A second person made the round of the house, trying to get in through one of the windows. Whether it was one person or two I cannot tell, replied Ling Chu. Tarling made a further inspection of the little wing. It was, as Ling Chu had said and as he had explained to the Chinaman, cut off from the rest of the house, and had evidently been arranged to give Mr. Milburgh the necessary privacy upon his visits to Hertford. The wing consisted of 3 rooms, a bedroom, leading from the sitting room, evidently used by Mrs. Rider, for her clothes were hanging in the wardrobe, the sitting room in which the murder was committed, and the spare room through which he had passed with Odette to the gallery over the hall. It was through the door in this room that admission was secured to the house. There's nothing to be done but to leave the local police in charge and get back to London, said Tarling when the inspection was concluded. And arrest Milburgh, suggested Whiteside. Do you accept Ling Chu's theory? Tarling shook his head. I am loath to reject it, he said, because he is the most amazingly clever tracker. He can trace footmarks which are absolutely invisible to the eye, and he has a bushman's instinct which in the old days in China led to some extraordinary results. They returned to town by car, Ling Chu riding beside the chauffeur, smoking an interminable chain of cigarettes. Tarling spoke very little during the journey, his mind being fully occupied with the latest development of a mystery, the solution of which still evaded him. The route through London to Scotland Yard carried him through Cavendish Place, where the nursing home was situated in which Odette Rider lay. He stopped the car to make inquiries, and found that the girl had recovered from the frenzy of grief into which the terrible discovery of the morning had thrown her, and had fallen into a quiet sleep. "That's good news, anyway," he said, rejoining his companion. "I was half beside myself with anxiety." "You take a tremendous interest in Miss Rider, don't you?" asked Whiteside dryly. Tarling brindled, then laughed. "Oh, yes, I take an interest," he admitted, "but it is very natural." "Why natural?" asked Whiteside. "Because," replied Tarling deliberately, "Miss Rider is going to be my wife." "Oh," said Whiteside in blank amazement, and had nothing more to say. The warrant for Milburgh's arrest was waiting for them, and placed in the hands of Whiteside for execution. "We'll give him no time," said the officer. "I'm afraid he's had a little too much grace, and we shall be very lucky if we find him at home." As he had suspected, the house in Camden Town was empty, and the woman who came daily to do the cleaning of the house was waiting patiently by the iron gate. Mr. Milburgh, she told them, usually admitted her at 8:30. Even if he was in the country, he was back at the house before her arrival. Whiteside fitted a skeleton key into the lock of the gate, opened it, the charwoman protesting in the interests of her employer, and went up the flagged path. The door of the cottage was a more difficult proposition, being fitted with a patent lock. Tarling did not stand on ceremony, but smashed one of the windows, and grinned as he did so. "Listen to that?" The shrill tinkle of a bell came to their ears. "Burglar alarm," said Tarling laconically, and pushed back the catch, threw up the window, and stepped into the little room where he had interviewed Mr. Milburgh. The house was empty. They went from room to room, searching the bureaus and cupboards. In one of these Tarling made a discovery. It was no more than a few glittering specks which he swept from a shelf into the palm of his hand. "If that isn't thermite, I'm a Dutchman," he said. "At any rate, we'll be able to convict Mr. Milburgh of arson if we can't get him for murder. We'll send this to the government analyst right away, Whiteside. If Milburgh did not kill Thornton Lyne, he certainly burnt down the premises of Dashwood and Solomon to destroy the evidence of his theft." It was Whiteside who made the second discovery. Mr. Milburgh slept on a large wooden four-poster. "He's a luxurious devil," said Whiteside. "Look at the thickness of those box springs." He tapped the side of that piece of furniture and looked round with a startled expression. "A bit solid for a box spring, isn't it?" he asked, and continued his investigation, tearing down the bed valance. Presently he was rewarded by finding a small eyelet hole in the side of the mattress. He took out his knife, opened the pipe cleaner, and pressed the narrow blade into the aperture. There was a click and two doors, ludicrously like the doors which deaden the volume of gramophone music, flew open. Whiteside put in his hand and pulled something out. "Books," he said disappointedly. Then, brightening up, "They are diaries. I wonder if the beggar kept a diary?" He piled the little volumes on the bed and Tarling took one and turned the leaves. "Thornton Lyne's diary," he said. "This may be useful." One of the volumes was locked. It was the newest of the books, and evidently an attempt had been made to force the lock, for the hasp was badly wrenched. Mr. Milburgh had, in fact, made such an attempt, but as he was engaged in a systematic study of the diaries from the beginning, he had eventually put aside the last volume after an unsuccessful effort to break the fastening. "Is there nothing else?" asked Tarling. "Nothing," said the disappointed inspector, looking into the interior. "There may be other little cupboards of this kind," he added. But a long search revealed no further hiding place. "Nothing more is to be done here," said Tarling, Keep one of your men in the house in case Milburgh turns up. Personally, I doubt very much whether he will put in an appearance. Do you think the girl has frightened him? I think it is extremely likely, said Tarling. I will make an inquiry at the stores, but I don't suppose he will be there either. This surmise proved to be correct. Nobody at Lyne's store had seen the manager or received word as to his whereabouts. Milburgh had disappeared as though the ground had opened and swallowed him. No time was lost by Scotland Yard in communicating particulars of the wanted man to every police station in England. Within 24 hours his description and photograph were in the hands of every chief constable, and if he had not succeeded in leaving the country, which was unlikely, during the time between the issue of the warrant and his leaving Tarling's room in Hertford, his arrest was inevitable. At 5 o'clock that afternoon came a new clue. A pair of ladies' shoes, mud-stained and worn, had been discovered in a ditch on the Hertford Road, 4 miles from the house where the latest murder had been committed. This news came by telephone from the chief of the Hertford Constabulary, with the further information that the shoes had been dispatched to Scotland Yard by special messenger. It was 7:30 when the little parcel was deposited on Tarling's table. He stripped the package of its paper, opened the lid of the cardboard box, and took out a distorted-looking slipper which had seen better days. A woman's, undoubtedly, he said. Do you note the crescent-shaped heel? Look, said Whiteside, pointing to some stains on the whitey-brown inner sock. That supports Ling Chu's theory. The feet of the person who wore these were bleeding. Tarling examined the slippers and nodded. He turned up the tongue in search of the maker's name, and the shoe dropped from his hand. What's on earth the matter? Asked Whiteside, and picked it up. He looked and laughed helplessly, for on the inside of the tongue was a tiny label bearing the name of a London shoemaker, and beneath, written in ink, Miss O. Rider. Chapter 30. WHO killed Mrs. Rider? The matron of the nursing home received Tarling. Odette, she said, had regained her normal calm, but would require a few days' rest. She suggested she should be sent to the country. I hope you're not going to ask her a lot of questions, Mr. Tarling, said the matron, because she really isn't fit to stand any further strain. There's only one question I'm going to ask, said Tarling grimly. He found the girl in a prettily furnished room, and she held out her hand to him in greeting. He stooped and kissed her, and without further ado produced the shoe from his pocket. Odette dear, he said gently, is this yours? She looked at it and nodded. Why yes, where did you find it? Are you sure it is yours? I'm perfectly certain it's mine, she smiled. It's an old slipper I used to wear. Why do you ask? Where did you see it last? The girl closed her eyes and shivered. In Mother's room, she said. Oh, Mother, Mother. She turned her head to the cushion of the chair and wept, and Tarling soothed her. It was some time before she was calm, but then she could give no further information. It was a shoe that Mother liked because it fitted her. We both took the same size. Her voice broke again and Tarling hastened to change the conversation. More and more he was becoming converted to Ling Chu's theory. He could not apply to that theory the facts which had come into his possession. On his way back from the nursing home to police headquarters, he reviewed the Hertford crime. Somebody had come into the house barefooted, with bleeding feet, and, having committed the murder, had looked about for shoes. The old slippers had been the only kind which the murderer could wear, and he or she had put them on, and had gone out again, after making the circuit of the house. Why had this mysterious person tried to get into the house again, and for whom or what were they searching? If Ling Chu was correct, obviously the murderer could not be Milburgh. If he could believe the evidence of his senses, the man with the small feet had been he who had shrieked defiance in the darkness and had hurled the vitriol at his feet. He put his views before his subordinate and found Whiteside willing to agree with him. But it does not follow, said Whiteside, that the barefooted person who was apparently in Mrs. Rider's house committed the murder. Milburgh did that right enough, don't worry. There is less doubt that he committed the Daffodil murder. Tarling swung round in his chair. He was sitting on the opposite side of the big table that the two men used in common. "I think I know who committed the Daffodil murder," he said steadily. "I have been working things out, and I have a theory which you would probably describe as fantastic." "What is it?" asked Whiteside, but the other shook his head. He was not for the moment prepared to reveal his theory. Whiteside leaned back in his chair and for a moment cogitated. "The case from the very beginning is full of contradictions," he said. "Thornton Lyne was a rich man, by the way. You're a rich man, now, Tarling, and I must treat you with respect." Tarling smiled. "Go on," he said. He had queer tastes, a bad poet, as is evidenced by his one slim volume of verse. He was a poseur, proof of which is to be found in his patronage of Sam Stay, who, by the way, has escaped from the lunatic asylum. "I suppose you know that." "I know that," said Tarling. "Go on." "Lyne falls in love with a pretty girl in his employ," continued Whiteside. "Used to having his way when he lifted his finger, all women that in earth do dwell must bow their necks to the yoke. He is repulsed by the girl and in his humiliation immediately conceives for her a hatred beyond the understanding of any sane mortal." "So far your account doesn't challenge contradiction," said Tarling with a little twinkle in his eye. "That is item number 1, continued Whiteside, ticking the item off on his fingers. "Item number 2 is Mr. Milburgh, an oleaginous gentleman who has been robbing the firm for years and has been living in style in the country on his ill-earned gains. From what he hears, or knows, he gathers that the jig is up. He is in despair when he realizes that Thornton Lyne is desperately in love with his stepdaughter. What is more likely than that he should use his stepdaughter in order to influence Thornton Lyne to take the favorable view of his delinquencies? Or what is more likely, interrupted Tarling, than that he would put the blame for the robberies upon the girl and trust to her paying a price to Thornton Lyne to escape punishment? Right again. I'll accept that possibility, said Whiteside. Milburgh's plan is to get a private interview, under exceptionally favorable circumstances, with Thornton Lyne. He wires to that gentleman to meet him at Miss Rider's flat, relying upon the magic of the name. And Thornton Lyne comes in list slippers, said Tarling sarcastically. That doesn't wash, Whiteside. No, it doesn't, admitted the other. But I'm getting at the broad aspects of the case. Lyne comes. He is met by Milburgh, who plays his trump card of confession and endeavors to switch the young man onto the solution which Milburgh had prepared. Lyne refuses, there is a row, and in desperation Milburgh shoots Thornton Lyne. Tarling shook his head. He mused a while, then. It's queer, he said. The door opened and a police officer came in. Here are the particulars you want, he said and handed Whiteside a typewritten sheet of paper. What is this? Said Whiteside when the man had gone. Oh, here is our old friend, Sam Stay. A police description. He read on, height 5'4", sallow complexion, wearing a grey suit and underclothing bearing the markings of the county asylum. Hello. What is it? Said Tarling. This is remarkable, said Whiteside, and read. When the patient escaped, he had bare feet. He takes a very small size in shoes, probably 4 or 5. A kitchen knife is missing and the patient may be armed. Bootmakers should be warned. Bare feet. Tarling rose from the table with a frown on his face. Sam Stay hated Odette Rider. The two men exchanged glances. Now, do you see who killed Mrs. Rider? Asked Tarling. She was killed by one who saw Odette Rider go into the house, and did not see her come out, who went in after her to avenge, as he thought, his dead patron. He killed this unhappy woman. The initials on the knife, M.C.A., stand for Middlesex County Asylum, and he brought the knife with him, and discovered his mistake. Then, having searched for a pair of shoes to cover his bleeding feet, and having failed to get into the house by any other way, made a circuit of the building, looking for Odette Rider and seeking an entrance at every window. Whiteside looked at him in astonishment. It's a pity you've got money, he said admiringly. When you retire from this business there'll be a great detective lost. Chapter 31. Sam Stay turns up. I have seen you somewhere before, ain't I? The stout clergyman in the immaculate white collar beamed benevolently at the questioner and shook his head with a gentle smile. No, my dear friend, I do not think I have ever seen you before. It was a little man, shabbily dressed, and looking ill. His face was drawn and lined, he had not shaved for days, and the thin, black stubble of hair gave him a sinister look. The clergyman had just walked out of Temple Gardens and was at the end of Villiers Street leading up to the Strand, when he was accosted. He was a happy-looking clergyman, and something of a student, too, if the stout and serious volume under his arm had any significance. "I've seen you before," said the little man. "I've dreamt about you." "If you'll excuse me," said the clergyman, "I am afraid I cannot stay. I have an important engagement." "Hold hard," said the little man, in so fierce a tone that the other stopped. "I tell you I've dreamt about you. I've seen you dancing with 4 black devils with no clothes on, and you were all fat and ugly." He lowered his voice and was speaking in a fierce earnest monotone, as though he was reciting some lesson he had been taught. The clergyman took a pace back in alarm. "Now, my good man," he said severely, "you ought not to stop gentlemen in the street and talk that kind of nonsense. I have never met you before in my life. My name is the Reverend Josiah Jennings." "Your name is Milburgh," said the other. "Yes, that's it, Milburgh. He used to talk about you. That lovely man, here." He clutched the clergyman's sleeve and Milburgh's face went a shade paler. There was a concentrated fury in the grip on his arm and a strange wildness in the man's speech. "Do you know where he is?" "In a beautiful vault built like an ooze in Highgate Cemetery. There's 2 little doors that open like the door of a church, and you go down some steps to it." "Who are you?" asked Milburgh, his teeth chattering. "Don't you know me?" The little man peered at him. "You've heard him talk about me. Sam Stay, why, I worked for 2 days in your stores, I did. And you've only got what he's given you. Every penny you earned he gave you, did Mr. Lyne. He was a friend to everybody, to the poor, even to a hook like me." His eyes filled with tears and Mr. Milburgh looked round to see if he was being observed. Thank you for listening to today's episode. I really hoped you enjoyed it. There will be more to come. Please subscribe not to miss out on what is next. I will be looking forward to your return. The music is by Madfan from Pixabay. To support this and other artists, go to pixabay.com. Sheila.